Yeah, and I don't know why this is where my brain starts going, because as Pat's talking about this, I'm thinking about like different types of training where all of these factors become relevant. And like some of the things that are like floating through my mind are like Pat's mass protocol and like how fucking terrible that is, and like CrossFit and then like bodybuilding. And what's really interesting is like on paper, these are kind of like a stepwise bridge to one another. You have like bodybuilding, and then you have mass in the middle, and then you have CrossFit, and it's like a gradient of how much you're fucking with your cardiovascular control mechanisms. And then if we were to keep going down that spectrum, eventually you're going to end up with endurance sports. And it makes me start to wonder if, for all of the different ways that you could interfere with your cardiovascular control mechanisms, if the adaptations that you get to each of those activities just makes you less likely to die from that specific insult. So if you're doing like bodybuilding training and you're creating a lot of localized tissue stress and hypoxia, and there's not a lot of vagal withdrawal, it's like, well, if you're continually getting bombarded with that environmental stress, like the best way to probably deal with it is to add more tissue. And if you're doing CrossFit, like the best way to deal with that specific insult that you're being slammed with over and over again is to get whatever adaptations you get from CrossFit. Who even knows what those are, really? And we need to like keep upping the volume and the RPE to keep getting continual adaptations, because if I keep giving you this insult, eventually you'll adapt enough that that specific stimulus isn't interfering with your cardiovascular control. So you bump the RP up, you bump the volume, and you keep getting that adaptation. But it's just interesting to me to think about it from that perspective, because when we're doing like bodybuilding training, like I've never thought about cardiovascular control when I'm doing a set of bicep curls. Like it's never floated my mind. But in that way, I think these topics that we're talking about today are, in a sense, a bridge between all of these different disciplines in training. Like whether you're trying to get like jacked as all hell, or you're trying to run a marathon as fast as you possibly can, fundamentally, the same three regulatory systems are governing all of those. And maybe how you adapt to those is really just the most logical way to cope with the specific environmental stressor you're giving yourself. And I think I actually got this from Pat like years ago, not even talking to you, listening to maybe you talking to Robbie or something, the idea of training as an environmental stressor that you need to cope with. And maybe you were talking about like polyvagal theory or something along those lines. But I remember that being like a big kind of light bulb moment for me. And it's kind of permeated my thinking in a lot of ways over the years.
You know, I'll for sure let Evan's statement stand alone, because I think it was well and thoroughly explained, and it just like, to me, it kind of goes to the discussion that is surrounding RPE as a total topic in a lot of ways. And when you get into that area, it's kind of like what's the signal to noise ratio, so to speak. And with certain kinds of exercises, there's a very clear signal with it. Like, and I would say that probably two easy to pick out ones would be like pure strength training. Like if you're doing a 1 rep max deadlift, or like long, slow, steady state aerobics. Like it's kind of like a very kind of clear, pure energy system or output sort of a thing. So there's not as many systems, and I like the word that you used there, Evan, insulted. Like there's just like one system that's really being like called upon to power you to a, you know, there's always a mix, but in this case, it's about as close as we can get to like, I can pretty much guarantee that with this deadlift, it's like, I think it's going to be the muscular system that's going to crap out. Okay. When it comes to the long, slow, steady state aerobic kind of a thing, I'm pretty sure it's going to be the aerobic system that's going to crap out, as long as people are trained, so to speak. But when it comes to CrossFit, I have no idea what system is going to be the one that makes you crap out. But I do know that in all three cases, you're probably going to crap out at a point where you hit an RPE of 10. All right. It's just that what is actually driving the RPE at any point in time. And so it's that like RPE is essentially like your brain taking all of the information coming from literally every combined system of the body, and it's interpreting it, and that is the final output, is what you would think of as how hard this seems to be. The cool thing, when you kind of go back to the old literature and the old experiments and the creation of RPE from Borg, is that they made the scale 6 to 20, because if you just put a 0 after whatever number the person says, it's unbelievably predictive of their heart rate. So, but they were doing, you know, a typical graded aerobic testing procedures in a laboratory. So that makes sense. Like, you're probably going to be primarily targeting with a very clear signal the aerobic system. But I guarantee you, if you were to somehow be able to RPE someone during a CrossFit metabolic WOD, you probably wouldn't get that much of a clear-cut heart rate response. Like, different WODs would probably create different heart rate correspondences with their RPE. You might have a lower heart rate with something that's incredibly locally fatiguing, and the person's at a 10 out of 10 RPE. So it ultimately makes it where the more mixed the sport, the more difficult it is to kind of target and train the fitness qualities for that particular endeavor. You know, I've got a client he's an older guy now, but he was a pretty high level cyclist when he was younger. And so he's like very cycling metrics driven, you know, like he has a pretty cool home gym setup, but he doesn't understand a lot of like the ideas that I have in regards to metrics for resistance training. You know, he's like, when are we going to do like watts per kilogram or something like that? And I'm like, well, it doesn't matter for what we're trying to accomplish right now. Like, that's an irrelevant thing. Like, he's like, but we could add so many other data points. And I'm like, we don't need all these data points. Like, we have the right number of data points for what we're trying to accomplish for your current goals. Adding more to that is just unnecessary in a lot of ways. But that's a bit of a sidetrack. But the point of it is that with cycling, it's a very closed system. You know, it's like the pedal goes around one time, and there's a defined distance that you travel for a specific gear. So it's kind of like force and distance are accounted for with a bike. Of course, it changes with hills and grades and wind and everything else. But on a flat track, one time around at a specific gear, it's a very fixed thing. And typically, like for an ergometer with cycling, to be able to test people, it's a very controlled system. So you're going to be able to have some very clear, definable, like, you can predict who's going to win the Tour de France pretty easily based on laboratory measures. Because the design of a bike is so uniform. When it comes to trying to predict performance in other activities or other sports, there is never going to be that helpful of like a singular, clear, defined variable, because so many different things can impact ultimately RPE. You know, I think like Marcori's work on RPE come from Italy. I think it's like the biopsychosocial, you know, model of endurance performance. He's really trying to get across this notion that for endurance performance, we need to simultaneously witness appropriate levels of essentially kind of like your biometrics need to be in a good place, but your external output variables need to be going in the right direction from a training standpoint. But simultaneously, we need to be monitoring your RPE at those levels. Like, I could witness someone making appropriate internal adaptations, but they haven't trained their perceptual qualities enough on that front to be able to essentially, there's been plenty of times where you've seen high-level athletes that should have their physiology in a place where they should win, and they've bonked in their performances because they haven't trained their mind and their RPE levels appropriately. So featuring both of those as a tracked, measurable entity is really essential at this point for endurance training. And I would just say that when it comes to these other mixed areas, it's going to be more muddied, you know, like if it's powerlifting or if it's like Tour de France cycling, it's actually it's an easier thing. in some ways. CrossFit is just this, the word that's coming to mind is contaminated. It's not the right word. I'm not trying to put this negative spin on it, but you have no idea what you're interpreting because there's so many systems that are being affected that are sending their threat message to the brain, and literally any of those messages could shut you down. Like it could be that you just got the worst callus ripped off your hand in your life, and that's the signal that's going to your brain that sends you from what should be a 6 RPE up to a 9.5. And that has nothing to do with your cardiac output or your cross-sectional area of your quad or the degree to which you occlude your veins, but then it could feed into that perceptually, the way that all these things can integrate and have feed forward and feedback mechanisms. So that's just kind of where the overall topic there just spun me.
Yeah, and I think CrossFit's interesting that it opens the door to have a mismatch between perceived exertion and where you actually are on a true exertion scale. And makes me think of like there's two ways that you could mismatch it. You could experience something out, like let's say 10 out of 10 RPE is your true physiologic limit. You experience a 7 out of 10 as a 10 out of 10, which means you have a lot of room for improvement. But if you truly hit that 10 out of 10 or you go above it, like that's where you really fuck up the system. And there are experiments where they get people to do that by mismatching. Like in Marcus Amon's lab, I don't even know how they get like IRB approval for doing these with an ethics board. But they basically take like undergrad students and they put fentanyl in their spines and they make it so they can't feel pain in their legs, and they have them do cycling tests to exhaustion. And the people like go out at like an 100% effort because they don't feel pain, and they just like grind themselves into a nub to the extent that they like lose the ability to stand up because they've created so much disruption in the lower limbs. I know Pat knows him too, like James Serby. I think he was actually on some of those papers and experiments, and they've just done some like insane shit where you're like, okay, that's a clear mismatch in the opposite direction. And you never see that in CrossFit. Like a lot of times in CrossFit, people they're objectively nowhere near failure. Like they're not going to fail a rep of a burpee, but they just stop moving. And like you can't will these people to do more work, and they're nowhere near true failure. So I think because there are so many fatigue inputs, it mismatches them in the other direction. Where if you think about like a more traditional test of work capacity, like it's not uncommon that when you watch elite cross country, people mismatch it in the other direction where they black out 10, 15 feet in front of the finish line. Like they'll just be running and you just see them go like, oh, lights out, and just like face plant in front of the finish line and not get up. And that's never happened at the CrossFit Games, which essentially tells us like these physiological insults are insulting enough and plentiful enough that it's causing people to misinterpret where they actually are in relation to their true physiologic limits. So even when we talk about like physiologic limiters in CrossFit, it's like, well, yeah, maybe we're seeing signs that your respiratory system's not coping with this, or your cardiovascular system, your muscular system. But at the end of the day, you haven't actually exhausted any of your limiters to the extent that you can't really even go anymore. So there is this psychological component to it. And like, I don't have an answer for how to remediate that. Like I try and fix the physiology as much as I can, improve performance. They could just bump that up. But I think even as we're getting these people fitter over time, they're probably still capping it at like a 7 to 8 out of 10 on a true exertion scale. And that's something that's kind of interesting, because if you could get someone to like truly go to the brink in a CrossFit Metcon, they might like it's possible that Matt Frazier could just go farther, closer to his 10 out of 10. Like objectively, all of his lab values might be the same as the number 2, 3, and 4 CrossFit Games athletes. And I have physiologic data on, I think 6 out of 10 of the top 10 male CrossFit Games competitors over the past 2 years. They're all pretty much identical, yet they have this large distribution. So I'm inclined to think that what actually separates them in these Metcons is more to do with how close they could get to their true exertional limit, versus that like one of their respiratory systems works 20% better than the other guy. Like there's morphological limitations to what your respiratory system could do. So it's not like this guy could develop his to a greater capacity. Like it's pretty fixed based on your body size.